let's try to make a longer story a bit shorter here by seeing what it is that we would have were we to accept this. At this point, we would want to decide which ones of these to accept as being the definitions of the factor, and if we decided just for simplicity not to take into account the specificity that's out here associated with this particular response, but just look at that part of this person's response that is associated with factor A, then we might say, well, we want to keep this person as the definer of factor C3, and that's the only person. These two people, let's say, although this is a little bit problematic because this person is partly A and partly B, and usually when you get somebody who's a mix, you wouldn't include that person because in using that person's Q sort as a definition of factor 2, you're also bringing some of factor A into the mix. So it's usually those people who are pure. We would designate this person, and we would designate this person, and we would leave this person out, and we would designate this person. If we were to do that, that would mean that factor 1 would be bipolar and would be defined by these two people. Factor 2, if we left this person out and just used that person, and factor 3, if we just use that person, and let's do that to keep the factors separate. What we're in effect going to get in this case, if we only have one person defining your factor, is we're just going to get that person's Q sort. So it's not really going to be a factor. One of the reasons you don't want to have a factor with only one person on it is then you cannot tell the difference between what is common to the factor and what is specific to that person because they're conflated. There's no way to separate them. Whereas if you have two people on a factor, then when you merge both of their Q sorts, what it is they have in common is what the factor comes to represent, and what they have that's different from the factor gets discarded. But there's no way to separate out when you just have this one person what part of his Q sort is factor 3 speaking, and what part of the Q sort is just respondent number 1. That idiosyncratic part of that person speaking, they're both in there.
Is there an absolute number of people you want to have?
Well, you like to have people with respectable loadings, you know, first, and relatively pure loadings. The thing is those things can be artificially affected, so you don't want to tamper with things like the Q sample necessarily just to get sharper loading, because what you end up doing, you get sharper loadings as the Q sample becomes less and less meaningful. In a sense, I mean, if you start clarifying things and modifying statements, you can finally get a purely liberal point of view. But by the time you've done that, it becomes obvious. You know, what you've got, you don't have any, nothing there to find. You just come out with obvious kinds of things. These people are liberals and these people are conservatives. So we don't want to purify statements in the same kind of way that the people in psychometrics would want to make sure that this only measures this particular trait, because you want a pure expression of that trait. But here what you're wanting to use is natural language. You want to leave as much naturalness as possible in the factor matrix and in the Q sorts. So you want to tamper with it as little as possible, except for cosmetic things like taking out social philosophy and just leaving philosophy.
What happens when you do that with an intensive study? You would look at those factors that are more frequently observed are the ones that represent what the person really is.
Oh no, not necessarily. But there you don't have any problem with the definition of the state of the factors. When you do an intensive study, 9 times out of 10 you're going to get extremely well-defined factors, because all of the specificity is in that. I mean, it's not uncommon to get. You know, you give 8, 10 conditions of instruction to one person to do the Q sort under different conditions. What does your mother think you're like? So you do that, and then what kind of person would you like to be, and what kind of person does your boss think you're like? And so you do all of these self-conceptions for different. And when you get the factors, it's not uncommon for those factors to count from 60, 70, 80% of the variance in those. So they end up being very well defined.
What does each one of these factors mean?
Well, that very much depends on the conditions that pop out and the interpretation of them and so forth. There would not be an easy answer to that. But there would nevertheless be a compelling explanation in retrospect. After you've gone through an intensive analysis, once you get the factors out, they usually are pretty clear pretty clear. Because they're usually accompanied by, you know, depth interviews, and what is artificial and what is not depends on who you're dealing with. But Stevenson gives an example in his book, if language was thought to be the important thing, and I think it had to do with his study of introversion, extroversion, but I'm not sure, that you could build language as an effect in there, in which there would be some things that would come out of Jung that would be psychoanalytic kinds of talking about the flow of libido and all of this kind of thing. And then there may be other kinds of statements that the ordinary person would use to say essentially the same thing, but at their level, and you put that in there as an effect. There could be reasons for doing that. Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering about this forced versus prejustification and the issue about understanding. If a subject is forced to distribute the statements and a number of them they don't really understand, they want to just put them all under zero, isn't there an active reflection?
Can you hold that? Because that relates to the one, and that's an item that's still on hold. Let me get the factor scores, because that's the basis for the interpretation, and come back to that. I don't want to dodge that. There was another one that was on hold from someone before the break. We may have answered it. Let me show you this part of it then, and we'll come back to those items. Do I want to rotate anymore? And so I say no at this point, and now it says that I can now associate particular individuals with the factors. So it says, what factor do you want to take? And I say, I want factor number 1. And the person that I want to select there is respondent number 3 and respondent number 6. So I say 3 and 6, and it comes back, and... Oh, wait a minute. I erred. The number of the factor is factor 1. Apparently I didn't take that. Okay, now then I put in a 3 and a 6. 3 and 6. Okay, and it comes back and puts X's. And what that's going to do is, when it comes time to estimate the factor scores, that is the scores associated with each one of the statements for these people on this factor as a composite, it will take person number 3's Q sort and person number 6. It will first reverse person number 3's Q sort, since it's negatively loaded, so everything that's -2 will be a +2, and +2 is a -2, and it will merge them together into one Q sort that represents both of them as a composite. So that's what this selection, and there's all kinds of standard error considerations from statistics. What is a big enough correlation or factor loading, and there are formulas for determining that kind of thing. But they're only aids. They're not to be used in any kind of absolute sense. And if I were to take factor 2 then and say I was going to include person number 2 only, that takes that person. And then if I were to take factor 3 and take that person number 1, I have that one. So those are the 3 factors then that I was interested in. That's the way they would be designated. Was there another question?
Yes. If I make a mistake, which I've done frequently, then I find that I'm forced to go all the way back to a position where it asks me, I have to get out and start again and say it's from a previous rotation, and do these again. In other words, hit a null, and then flag from the first again. Is there another way that can be fixed? Let's say I meant to put in number 4, person number 4 in factor 1, but it's too late.
Well, no, it's not, because now if I wanted person number 4, I could now just say factor 1, and I could say now 3, 6, and 4. 3, whoops, excuse me, I hit something wrong here. Factor 1. Okay.
So then I did explain
3.
Because I have tried to do something here, and it gets all...
Which factors would you like to write out? Oh, excuse me, write out. I'm sorry.
Yes.
I've already gone past that point where I still have that option. But after you've done a factor, if you haven't then gone on to the next step, which is which factors do you want to write out, which is where I am now. You can go back to the factor 1 again and go back and put in the x's. Put in all the x's you had before plus person number 4 in this case if you wanted to do that. And it'll...
Go back and start from the correlation file that you have, and do your rotations again, mark your factors again, and then you eliminate the problem. You always have
That gets to be so funny if you have like 60 people or something like that.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah,
You should do the factor marking with the editor. The program writes out the file with the extension RAOT, and you can load it in the editor and put the x's by hand.
Yes, that's right. That's right. You can.
If you have only 6 persons and 3 factors,
So
it's
it's just
okay
reading
this way.
markings, it's not doing anything else, so you could
Yeah.
do that.
Is yours on a mainframe?
No, I'm not, yes, but I'm also now using this,
Yeah.
so.
See, I've used only the mainframe, so I'm not quite sure what all of the PC version would do, but it is quite possible to go into the file list on the mainframe, open up the file that says qconference dot, or qconference rotated, and go in and just delete an X, put in an X someplace else, and just edit it there, yeah. Then if you wanted to change the order, let's say for some reason we wanted factor 2 to be factor 1, we say print it out factor 2 first, factor 3 second, and factor 1 last.
Why would you want to do that?
If, for example, if I was doing a study on political ideology, something about liberalism and conservatism and so forth, and if I realize that this is the liberal factor, because I knew that this person was a liberal, and I'd interviewed the person and so forth, and so I tried to maximize that person. I knew this person was a conservative and so forth. But this factor, even though I may understand what this factor is at this point, I'm thinking ahead of writing out a manuscript in which I want to be able to describe for the reader liberalism and conservatism, which they're anticipating getting because of the nature of liberalism and conservatism. And then after they've been introduced to what will now be factor 1 and factor 2, I can now give them factor 3, and they have some sort of basis for comparison and contrast because they've already seen factor 1 and factor 2 before they've got. So you're sort of planning ahead. What you're thinking about now is in what order would I like to describe these factors in the manuscript. So you can manipulate the order in which they are in this case. Now factors 4 through 6 are going to be discarded. So yep, I have that. And now it has saved all of that, and to do the Q analysis, which is to calculate all the factor scores, you just press 7 and it's all done with that. Let's see, now then we're off into a domain I'm not so sure about. We'd say no in this case, no. Now is when I would jump over to the MS-DOS and start reading the listing file. All right, so I would come over here. And I go up to File, is that correct? Go up to File. And open?
Yes. If I can say something.
Yes.
Place,
Mm-hmm.
many people who are used to Windows programs or even command line or DOS programs are not aware when they run PQ method that it really does something because modern programs usually bring the output to the screen. And this program brings everything to files, and you need an additional program. We use the MS-DOS editor for color purposes. You could use Notepad or another program to load the output files, and you even can manipulate input files, and everything is documented in the head file.
Okay.
Word processor, for that matter, will open those files.
Okay. We select in the Q conference was the project title I gave, and the list file then here would be selected, and we would go to what now? To just yeah, okay, right, okay, the OK button. All right. Now then, here is the original correlation. You recall the correlation between 1 and 2 is minus 0.13. So there is the original 6x6 correlation matrix. Here are the original unrotated factors that we began with, and we put factor 1 against factor 2 and rotated that and so on and so forth. It saves you also a history of the rotations. The first rotation was minus 30 degrees. That was for factors 1 and 2, and then we took factor 3 against factor 4 and rotated 150 degrees. So you can reconstruct, if you ever needed to, your strategy. And that's sometimes useful when you come back to it a few years later and want to know what on earth was in your mind. Sometimes you can plot these out. You can plot these out and it becomes obvious to you again why it was that you did something. So that's very useful. And here are the factors now. Again, what was factor 2 before is now factor 1. What was factor 3 is now factor 2, and now factor 3. And what happened here? We did not get an X on that bottom one.
That was when I asked the question, you took it out by accident.
Oh, did I? Oh, drat. Let's see. Maybe with time we can go back. I inadvertently left the X. Apparently took it off and didn't realize it for respondent 6 for factor 3, and that's obviously very important with a very... Well, we couldn't at this point have... Yeah. What would I do here? Exit. Whoop, 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 whoop. Up. Is this one? Yes, you may. You may, indeed. Because you'll probably have to go back to the file itself.
You shouldn't have closed the editor file. Now we have to move up to the directory.
So it would be, there it is. Okay. There you go. Well, now you have to, okay. Let's see here. I can come out here.
Don't sit down.
Okay. Now then, would... Oh, it's a read-only file. I can't modify it. Can we...
File being closed. No, that's right, you didn't close the file.
Well, it doesn't matter. This is also a feature of the program. If you quit and start it at another time, you will find the same data you left.
Let's not worry about this. This is, we can explain this, I think.
Oh, what was it? Q conference. Where should be the X?
Right here.
Oh, yeah.
Back up one.
So now it's saved.
Okay. Now we just go right to the Q analysis? To the Q analysis part? Okay. Try this again. Okay, now here we go. Now we go to MS-DOS, right?
No, you can go to this file.
Yeah, yeah, okay. Whoop.
Well, it's still the old file. Doesn't matter.
Just hit it again.
File.
Ah, I see. Got it. Open.
Open.
Okay. Now then we need to get to there, cucumbers list, and okay, right? Okay, now let's see if we got what we need. Sorry. Yep, we're back in business. Okay. Now here we go. This gives just the means, the standard deviation of each Q sort. That's of no importance. This is the statements in serial order from 1 to 15, and over here it, although it's off the screen, I don't know if there's any way to...
Or you can,
Yeah.
you can use the...
Yeah, sure. Yeah, of course. Where is that? No, I don't see this. Yeah, but these are the factor scores, but they're in normalized z-score form. Here's for factor 1. This indicates that statement number 1 ranked 15th for that factor. The second statement ranks 6th, so that these are kind of the rank order, and these are the normalized scores. Then it goes down and gives you a rank ordering just for factor 1, which only was respondent number 2. What did I do with the statements here? I have these.
These correlations are only due to the flagged individual.
That's
Is
right.
that correct?
That's right. So this
If
isn't.
we didn't flag anyone.
There wouldn't be any factors then. I mean, it wouldn't. I think it probably wouldn't even run without being flagged. Yeah. So that this factor, which was just one person, was interested in quantum theory. Q is an art and science, philosophy of science kinds of concerns. Was this you on that factor? Oh, that was you. Okay. So that was John's factor. The second factor had, who was it? Respondent number 1, was it? The connection to inner behaviorism. All of these that are up here are the highest factor scores, so that if we were turning these back into +3 to -3, number 5, number 10, and number 13 would be +2, sorry. 7, 9, and 15 would be +1. The next 3 would be 0. The next 3 would be -1. And in fact, it gives us a table of that later on. So this is simply the statement ordering for that factor.
But this is the one that I think was entered incorrectly. This is the one individual.
Oh, that was upside down?
Right.
Aha, okay. If that's the case, then this, we could either have turned the factor upside down by rotating factor 2 with itself and then rotating 180 degrees, or just interpret the factor upside down. Now then, statements 1, 14, and 2 would be the +3s. This was the factor of the person who did the Q-sort backwards, so everything would have to be turned upside down. And then the third factor was actually a composite and bipolar with Peter Schmolk at one end and Mike at the other end, part of Mike. So that this means for this factor that Peter Schmolk would have, although again each person is not correlated perfectly with the factor, although yours is very close, 0.98, that these 3 would have been the +3 for Peter Schmolk. And if Mike Knight was totally on factor, this factor instead of being partly on another factor, then those would have been the ones that he would have tended to give a -2 to. These would have been Mike Knight's +2s and Peter Schmolk's -2s in that sense. So that there's really 3 factors in this case, but 4 points of view, or 4 attitudes, or 4, in this sense, 4 reasons for motivations for coming to the Q conference. Then it goes through and compares factor 1 with 2, puts them in an order. This is a statement that creates a factor score difference between factor 1 and factor 2 that's the biggest one, the biggest difference, then the second biggest difference. And at the bottom are the statements that factor 2 is given the highest scores and factor 1 is given the lowest scores, so that you can see in rather stark terms what it is that distinguishes 1 from 2, and then it goes to 1 and 3, and then it goes to 2 and 3, does all those comparisons. Then it gives the +2 to -2 score format, so that this is statements 1 through 15. All you see now is factor 1. This statement gets a -2 and a +2, a +1, +2. There's also a column for factor 2 and for factor 3, so you can. These again are in serial order from 1 to 15. This is usually the table that is of the most importance. That and the table of factor loadings. The factor loading says which people are in the factors together. And this table says what is the content of those factors. These people in factor A differ. This shows you how they differ, why they differ, and this is usually the table that you report. This is important because the criticisms about Q are oftentimes about things that are in the factor loadings. That is your sample of people, a random sample, and Whereas the subjectivity, which is what Q methodology is interested in, is in the factor scores. It's because of the different subjective orientations of these people that this factor gives that statement a -2. This shows how this way, this reason for coming to the conference differs from this reason. And these are the subjective things, and this is what's really important, is the factor scores, not the factor loading so much, whereas most of the criticisms have to do with the differences amongst the people. Because, you know, that's what our methodology is interested in. Yes?
If I load these back into a statistical program and have other individuals do the same Q-sort, could I then do the regression analysis and get my R value and determine how
Yes.
people correlated with the various...
Yes. This tells you down here what the variance of the Q-sort distribution is. And remember when we did the correlation, we divided by K, which was a constant. That constant is actually 2, because there are 2 Q-sorts for each correlation, times N, which is 15 in this case, times the variance. And what was it, 60 when we had the yeah, if you took 15 times 2 times the variance, you get 60. That's what that is. So that means that you could take some new person, put that person's Q-sort scores right down here, calculate the correlation with factor 1, that would be that person's factor loading for the first factor. If the factors are orthogonal and they're close enough, very low correlations, and then for factor 2 and for factor 3. So you can take people who weren't in the study initially and see which factor they would have been in had they been in the study by just seeing how they correlate with the factor scores. Their individual Q-sorts with the factor scores. Then it goes down and gives some statistical information in terms of the number of people who define the factor. We put in an assumed reliability test retest. If you gave the same people the Q-sort, would they correlate with themselves at time 2? And we, in the absence of an empirical number, we use 0.8, which is generally pretty conservative. And on the basis of the reliability of each factor then, excuse me, of each person's Q-sort, we then calculate a composite reliability for the factor. As you can see, if there are 2 people, like on factor 3 has 2 people, and if each of those persons has a personal reliability of 0.8, the reliability of the factor goes up to 0.88. The factor is more reliable than the people comprising it. Well, if you only have 1 person on the factor is no more reliable than the reliability of the person who is the factor. And that affects, and there are formulas for all this, that affects then the standard error. If one factor gives a statement a +2 and another one gives it a 0, does that indicate that one factor reacted substantially differently in some statistical sense, so that these factor scores, or these standard errors are used to determine that, just like in any ordinary hypothesis testing sense, is the amount of distance between this statement and this factor compared to some other factor a big difference or not. And then it picks out the statements that distinguish first factor 1 from both factor 2 and factor 3. So in this case, factor 1 has given statement number 3 a substantially higher score than that statement got in factor 2 or factor 3. We can't see those other scores on this screen. Statement number 9 is one that factor 1 gave a substantially lower score than factors 2 and 3. So it pulls out those statements that distinguish factor 1 both from factor 2 and from factor 3, and then pulls out those statements that distinguish factor 2 from both factor 1 and factor 3, and then it pulls out those statements that distinguish factor 3 from both factor 1 and factor 2. And then at the bottom, this part needs to be fixed, and we now have somebody on it at the moment, are the statements that have essentially the same score across factors, the so-called consensus statements. But that is actually erroneous. That is not a true table unless there are only 2 factors, then it's okay. But if there's a third factor, then the person who wrote the program misunderstood what consensus was supposed to be, and therefore built in a routine that gives something other than what we meant consensus to be. So that's got to be dickered with.
So you can't use
So just ignore that bottom.
You can't use if you have more than 2 factors.
More than 2 factors, no, it can be quite off then. And that's the end of the printout. And that's the end of the story.